You make this rather snappy, won't you? I have some very heavy thinking to do before 10 o'clock.
All right. Hey, Steve Smith.
Hello, Bret Starr.
I'm Bret Starr. I'm the CEO and founder of the Starr Conspiracy. He's Steve Smith. He's my business partner for about 17,000 years and the chief marketing officer, owner, partner, etc. of Starr Conspiracy, part of the group of four who own this agency called the Starr Conspiracy, the experience agency. More on that later. But we're going to talk about AI today because it just hasn't been talked about enough.
Yeah, no one's talking about AI.
No one's
That's really
about
bothering
AI.
me.
I keep at, for the last 10 years since we started going to HR Tech and seeing everyone talking about AI, that started about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
I'm not wrong about that. Maybe 7 years ago. Yeah, because we've been going to HR Tech for fucking 20 years. But it was about 7-8 years ago that like everybody said they had an artificial intelligence solution. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really artificial intelligence. It wasn't what we think of as artificial intelligence. And usually they didn't have an artificial intelligence solution. They had like a talent acquisition solution that had some component of natural language processing or machine learning or something like that. And inevitably it usually made shit worse instead of better. But now there's like generative AI and all this AI stuff going on, and Terminator 3 is happening, and robots are falling in love with humans and trying to get people to leave their spouses.
Yep.
And mass confusion. Let's talk about AI, what it does, what it doesn't do, what the positive business cases are, negative business cases specifically for work tech. What do you think about that?
Oh, is that a question?
I know I didn't create any space for you. I'm sorry. I'm really amped up this morning.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is it's like the hype cycle on generative AI has really gotten compressed, and we went from, the heightened expectations to the trough of disillusionment pretty quickly, like in a span of a few weeks, it seems like. Obviously not quite the case, but it seems like, especially kind of in this environment, people are looking for something to kind of latch onto as a positive for tech kind of going forward. And so I think that there was a lot of that. I had a conversation with an investment banker last week about this, a lot of things, but we were talking about generative AI, and his point of view was just like, to me, it just seems like it's a big brand game. He goes, I don't see where the application is yet at sort of the startup level. And I don't disagree with that. Certainly there are generative AI startups that, are certainly crowding the field right now, but, generative AI is not, as you pointed out before, is not necessarily the more applicable part of it for work tech.
Well, it's interesting because you brought up something that a lot of people aren't talking about. I haven't actually considered it significantly, but this notion that like, every time there is a bubble bursting, there is another bubble being formed, right?
Yeah.
And, some people look at that and say, the cynical view is that's a shell game. That's a brand game. That's like, how do we increase valuations for tech companies? Well, let's usher in a new era of, tech innovation. There is some of that, right? But the reality is there are technological advances that are so significant that they create entire markets and, disrupt entire fields. Did you see the movie Glass Onion? Did we talk about Glass Onion?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, really funny. The disruptors.
Yeah.
Anyway, could go on a bit.
I loved it.
I don't want to spoil it for anyone.
Pretty great. I loved it. I like Ed Norton's fake Elon Musk the best.
Yeah, pretty great. Can we just take a moment to abbreviate? Just abbreviate.
Yeah, let's abbreviate.
Yeah. Anyway, this idea that when there are dark clouds, hanging over us, the ability to point towards a bright horizon and say, this is the tech that's going to change everything.
Yeah.
Can invest some companies with at least the perception of better prospects. Microsoft was a company that changed the world until they weren't, right? Until they were like second, third, fourth place in everything. And then they started to, kind of get their swagger back a little bit and then a lot. And now one could argue that, with any challenges that Microsoft faces, hey, at least they're the company that put a bagazillion dollars into AI when AI was by some people's prognostications, the most important technological achievement and advancement in decades. But let's put the cynical case aside. Let's say that AI is real. It's important. It's going to have significant impacts on every aspect of society, in much the way that the invention of the World Wide Web did, as one example. What is the case for AI and work tech? And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a CEO the other day who was thinking about, this is a CEO of a, let's say a performance management company. It's more than that, but performance management company. And he was considering the case of assigning a team to investigate the application of Chat GPT, generative AI solution, GPT on writing performance reviews. And he was like, look, I've been in this business for a long time, been in this industry. Writing performance reviews is, awful. People aren't, great at it. You end up having to write so many during performance review cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, that's an awful idea. That's an awful idea. Just absolutely terrible. And here's why. And I referenced, you remember when we got Success Factors for the first time because of our PEO was able to give us Success Factors for free. And we put everyone through an official performance review cycle. And we were reading all the performance reviews, and basically people were cutting and pasting the recommended text for how to tell somebody they're a 4 on something. Right. And so every review that we read was like basically the same. And so we completely discounted all of the feedback and said it was pretty awful. And I was like, imagine that times like 100, because once people catch wind that you're using AI to write these deeply personal, performance reviews, all of the feedback is going to be immediately discounted. And it's going to be like you hired basically, a robot to do a job that a human should do, because this is one of the most human things ever. And I think that's a case where generative AI is actually not a really, good solution. You have all these CEOs who are saying, oh, I've been writing emails with, Chat GPT, and I've saved all this time over here. There's some things that ought not be automated to that degree that are so deeply personal within the human capital or work tech context that it doesn't feel like generative AI is a great solution. Thoughts?
Right. Well, yeah. And I think that, certainly AI has a place. Like even in performance reviews, it's just like, is it, looking to remove biased language? Is it looking for language that could present compliance issues? I mean, there's I think a lot of value that can come into the equation from AI, and we're already seeing a lot of this kind of coming into market. And so I think AI is definitely going to benefit work tech, broadly across the spectrum. But I think that it is a legitimate question of, to what extent, if any, generative AI is going to kind of factor into that.
Well, I think that's the great point. And, I think it's worth exploring what is the difference between generative AI. It's in the name. It generates shit. The cases that you just described of going through and doing sentiment analysis, for instance, or, checking for bias or compliance issues in content that's exchanged between employees. That's more of a machine learning or natural language processing NLP context. And, AI, unfortunately, is being used as a catch-all right now for generative AI. And so, having AI make suggestions to coaches, managers saying, hey, you might not want to call that person a shithead in their performance review. That's good.
Know.
Yeah. What's that?
What do robots know? Maybe you do.
Well, maybe you want to, but should you? I mean, this was a real case. I worked with an organization that was testing NLP in a packing facility, a pork packing facility. And it was primarily being used to coach managers on giving feedback because there were, like words like "you shithead," "don't do this, that, or the other thing." And, people got the positive feedback that maybe that's not an effective communication style when trying to improve someone's performance. That's really different than robot, tell me, please write this performance review for me, right? And that's generative AI. And while there are a lot of contexts where generative AI can be explored, I think people are about to waste a bunch of time. And that's the part that's most concerning to me. If you convene a council to look at the applications of Chat GPT on non-generative AI context, where you can just like ask yourself a common sense question, is generative AI good here or not? Just start there before you start messing around with all these consumer, AI tools, these generative AI tools. Agree? Disagree?
No, I agree with that. I think that there's also the, just kind of the compliance issues, because one thing that's coming clear through some of these early generative AI tests is just sometimes the text you get is just flat out wrong. And if you're a manager and you're trying to offer guidance to an employee and you're just basically hitting the button and not really thinking about, okay, is this feedback relevant or even accurate? There's certainly, I think, a high degree of potential for things to go wrong.
I think that's a good way to think about it too, is like in discussing the different use cases for AI. In certain contexts, AI is the creator and humans are the editor. In other contexts, humans are the creator and AI is the editor.
Right.
There are a lot of contexts where, humans being the creator and AI being the editor makes sense. And that's the just push the button, scenario where people can get in trouble for a lot of things. There are also scenarios, I think, where AI being the creator and humans being the editor makes sense, but those are the ones that you have to be more careful about, in my opinion, because if the editing doesn't happen, as often happens when humans are the final link in the supply chain,
right?
That last thing doesn't happen, that's where you can get in a lot of trouble. So, for instance, in this context of humans being the editor and AI being the creator, I think that has huge potential in work tech to disrupt the professional services market. And I want to be really clear about that. Work tech companies are often valued based on the composition of their revenue streams.
Right.
If their revenue stream is primarily software as a service, their value in the market is usually determined by a multiple on their revenue. And there's just a different, type of strategic buyer, a different calculus that's used. But I think the simplest way to think about it is, the more software revenue you have, the more valuable your company is in the market. The more professional services revenue you have, the more likely you are to be valued based on a multiple of profit. Right. And they're just generally not as highly valued. If you look at a company that, companies who sit in the middle between software and services, and I think a really easy to understand example is engagement measurement or surveys. There's a software component, the survey, component, et cetera. And there's the services component of the people who write the change management plans for the annual, engagement report and say, okay, here's what your scores were, but here's what you need to do about it. Well, that can turn a lot of these engagement measurement companies into predominantly services companies. So think about it all the way out to its logical conclusion, like Willis Towers Watson. Are they a software company? Or are they a services company? It really depends on, where you poke. But using AI to generate the first draft of those change management reports based on the survey responses and then having a human editor can reclassify a lot of, and not just reclassify the revenue like an accounting trick, but actually like make it software generated work. So I think that's a pretty positive case for, generative AI.
Yeah. And I think it's the same thing when you look at, just kind of all across sort of the talent spectrum. It's just like, whether you're talking about performance software, goal software, on and on and on, Your software is basically just implementing your strategy. And a lot of times, no, there are employers out there who buy a software solution without having put a shred of thought into the strategy, and that gets sort of dumped in the lap of the software provider. And it's just like what they have to figure out is to what extent do they want to provide essentially professional services support to help their clients be successful with the software. And that's an ongoing sort of seesaw battle between providing more services so that the software will be successful, but then, as you pointed out, seeing the software profit margins getting eaten into and having to assume more of a professional services component than their business model can or should allow. And so I think there's a lot of potential when you're looking at this AI to provide the level of customer enablement to make the software successful, but do it in a way that allows them to classify that as software revenue, to your point, which is a huge game changer, I think.
Yeah. And you brought up another interesting point that, it's just like the more you double click on this topic and really think through the ramifications outside of just the rush to how do we use this, which is what I think the phase that everyone's in right now is like, everybody's got to, jump on this right now. You brought up a really interesting point, which is the likelihood that people think through what their strategy is when they buy software or what the impact will be on their strategy or their culture. And we've, learned this through the years. You have to be careful what software products you purchase because that's the work experience. And it has a way, those software products are often built on a worldview. And that software product, if it becomes like the system that you live in or whatever, has a way of rewiring people's worldview based on how the software works.
Yeah.
Now imagine that with AI. Like this is technological determinism writ large, and it's happening right now. Imagine that where like the AI is actually leading the culture in an organization based on the work experience with all of these, like dark dystopian, layers on top. I will say there was some disturbing stuff. Usually I'm like, New York Times guy goes in and, has a 4-hour conversation with chat GPT. And, it tells him to leave his spouse and that he wants the AI wanted the nuclear codes and wanted to, all that stuff. And normally I'd be like, haha, that's funny. It's kind of part of it's not that funny.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If you read that whole transcript, it's sort of like, the AI really came off as kind of a sulky, petulant teenager. And it's just like, okay, so what is that AI connected to? Is it like, deciding whether or not buses crash together, or we're going to like turn off the hydroelectric plant, or maybe there's nuclear go codes attached to it. It's just like we start thinking about, how much technology we have wired to critical infrastructure that determines who lives and who dies, then that gets pretty scary pretty fast.
Well, just self-driving cars, full, auto drive mode, et cetera. And so the question is, if you take it out of the realm of science fiction and perverse dystopia, how much of the decision-making and the culture creation inside your organization do you want to leave up to Chat GPT or similar tools, OpenAI? Because that's what people are talking about when they're talking about like honestly reviewing cases or business cases where it's like, hey, what if we could use generative AI as a way to get people started on writing their performance reviews or to get people started on this or that or the other? Well, the AI is making decisions, and those decisions become part of the cultural exchange between humans inside that company. Yeah. And it seems to me much more visceral than just like, oh, we chose Asana over Trello, and now, we think in rows and columns instead of cards. as a terrible example. But no, like our
example.
fucking performance reviews are snarky and we're not snarky.
Well, yeah, but I think that, if you're talking about that, the technological determinism aspect, it's just like that's happening already. It's just like if you have Slack versus Outlook, it is having an influence on your culture and how people interact.
Mm-hmm.
And all of, whether you're talking about Asana versus Trello or, Microsoft versus Google or Salesforce versus, whatever else, all of these decisions have an impact on an organization, the people, and the culture in ways that most of the time we don't think about.
Yeah, we'll take this case of Starbucks, right? So, there's a strong push to unionize in Starbucks. A Slack channel was created. No, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Amazon. And there was a strong return to work push in Amazon. And a Slack channel was created a couple of days ago that now has like 14,000 people in the Slack channel within Amazon lobbying for what they call the S team, which is the leadership team in Amazon, to reconsider their policy of requiring most people to be back at work at least 3 days a week. And can you imagine, like, one of the areas where, people are talking about the application of generative AIs in help desk contexts? Can you imagine dropping a help desk solution into Slack, responding to employee comments about rethinking the return to work context, and how that could with a Slack channel that happens that fast, explodes to that size on such a contentious issue in the current zeitgeist? Sorry, redundant, in our zeitgeist. AI there, generative AI there from a help desk context embedded in Slack could be nightmarish in terms of the outcome. Because a lot of times you can't tell. I mean, we like to think we can tell, like if you're chatting with a bot or, like a human, but sometimes I don't, sometimes I'm talking to people on the phone, like at Vivint or DirecTV, you jerks, trying to cancel my service. And they're so script driven in what they're trying to achieve that I can't tell whether I'm talking to a human or a robot. So,
and that's what's interesting is when you're on with a chat bot with, customer service, you can usually tell when they're just kind of asking diagnostic questions and then they flip you over to a live person. It's usually pretty obvious. But imagine, 5 or 10 years from now, that won't be the case. And I mean, to make things even more disturbing and creepy, it's just like, you may be talking to somebody on video that is completely synthetic. They may look human, they may have a human voice, they may be but I mean, already that technology exists now in a rudimentary form that, and which is fraught with, many of its own challenges. It's just when that's the case, it's just at what point, if everyone's virtual, at what point do you just have a virtual manager?
Yeah, doesn't this feel, because like, that's a great point. Why not just have a virtual manager? Because if it's all just about like check-ins and, monitoring progress and, talking about how you feel in engagement surveys. And I mean, I'm obviously reducing some very complex issues, but there are checklists for things that, are kind of the hallmark of effective management, as viewed through the, knowledge economy, lens. And a lot of that stuff could be automated by AI. Like if you just had to check in with the robot, I mean, how different is that than updating your cards in your workflow system?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got virtual assistants. If all of this is script driven and you're going essentially off of a playbook, it's not that much of a leap to think that, eventually you could have a virtual manager. And, then it's just sort of like, okay, so what if my virtual manager is like Hal from Space Odyssey?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Brett, I can't do that.
I'm sorry.
Shoot you off into space.
What about a virtual CEO? It's not that crazy to imagine. Is it?
And it's just, and when you think about,
public held organization, robot smashing all of the data in the world, crunching it, looking at the numbers. This is going to have an impact on shareholder value. This is where the supply chain situation is. Here are the 3 imperatives for the company. Employees must follow these 3 imperatives. Like that doesn't sound that crazy to me. To have a virtual manager. Go ahead.
But also, it's just like what does sound crazy is when you think about how much WorkTech has veered toward being more employee centric and human centric. And, if you're like, what would be essentially the protocols for a virtual manager, but what do employees actually need from a manager? To me, I think that those are sometimes poles apart.
Yeah, until they aren't.
There's what the playbook says, and then there's what a person actually needs.
Yeah, until they aren't, until people are forced to work or live in a context to where it becomes the expectation, to where it becomes the new cultural norm.
Right.
So if you just hate the idea of a virtual manager because you're 45 years old and you've been working for a long time, and it doesn't meet your needs because, you want to talk to somebody and be heard and, all that stuff. Well, that's really different than a kid who, just got out of school, got out of college, or, went into a job or whatever. They've always had a virtual manager. That's all they know. And they like the separation of, kind of church and state when it comes to human interaction versus transactional interactions, which could increasingly become the norm in like more decentralized autonomous organizations where people are just kind of working when and where they want. So those norms can change because of the technology, which is technological determinism. But I kind of want to go back to this virtual CEO component, lest people think we're crazy. Think about it. Or the virtual manager, either one. Did you read the article about the person? Have you ever played the game Go? The strategy game Go?
Yeah.
Did you read the article about the person who finally beat the AI player? So the world organization that runs Go tournaments allows companies to create AI players and compete against humans. And no surprise, they've run the table, right? Like ever since AI came in, it's really hard for humans to beat AI. Well, one player recently, working with a consultancy, used a different program to model like over 1 million matches against the best AI player in the Go league, and found a weakness. And, without getting too much into the game, it would be really obvious to another human what you were trying to do, which is, hey, I'm building this big circle to ensnare everything, but I'm doing some things over here and over here, so you don't see the big picture happening. Like if you were a human looking at it, you'd say, like, what is this person doing? But the AI was distracted by all these other moves and was trying to put together the intention of those other moves while the circle just keeps closing. So this person won 18 out of 20 matches against AI. But there's always been, since, Watson played chess, there's always been this fascination with pitting computers against humans in a strategic context, right? And isn't that what the CEO or the manager is supposed to do? Like, aren't they supposed to be the best strategic people or the best, like whatever, right? They're supposed to see the game in a way that, mere mortals don't. And, okay, so if a computer can beat a human in chess, couldn't a computer beat a human at, like running a company? Couldn't a computer beat a human at Sid Meier's Civilization? I mean, it's like, at what point?
Well, and then when if you're getting into kind of the ROI component, if a human CEO is making however many times the, average pay of a person in that organization, at what point does it just sort of become like, well, you know what? The AI CEO is a much better, more efficient, and cost-effective way to approach that.
Yeah. All you have to do at that point, for now, in the world that we live in, is to hire the face of the company.
Right.
So it becomes a branding.
Which you can create with AI. And it will look like
eventually, right? Eventually. So it brings us back to probably the most predictive television show in history, Max Headroom.
Mm-hmm.
There we are. Max Headroom has arrived.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that we have solved AI.
We have solved absolutely nothing. I'm more concerned than ever, and I will continue building my cabin in the woods where I will live in my wearing my tinfoil hat.
Well, I will say this in closing. These conversations are important because people haven't gone this far into just thinking about the different use cases. And okay, yeah, sure. Virtual CEO aside, these other things that we're talking about, there's a rush to adopt technology. Well, this always happens. There's a rush to adopt technology without actually thinking about the use cases, without thinking them through and the consequences. And that can lead to a lot of lost productivity. But worst case scenarios, it leads to some very damaging applications of the technology that are hard to unwind. And so we're not Luddites, nor are we Philistines, but we're definitely not Luddites. And however, I would say that on the generative AI side of the spectrum of AI, like I'm all about machine learning, I'm all about NLP, I'm all about, all this other stuff that kind of hovers around definitions of AI, proven, effective, etc. But with the generative AI, I think people ought to be cautious and, think through the business case in a very deep way before they just start trialing. Now, I'm literally talking to significant companies in work tech right now that are putting teams together to figure out how to embed OpenAI or Chat GPT into their solutions, as if it's something. And hey, can we get this out in 2 weeks? It's like, careful.
Yeah, slow your roll there.
All right, man. Anything you want to close on?
No, there's nothing I want to close on. I'm absolutely terrified by this conversation, and I'm more convinced than ever that everything will go wrong.
Yeah, I'm a little more freaked out than I was at the beginning of the conversation. All right. Well, please subscribe. I'm Bret Starr. He's Steve Smith. We are hanging out at the Starr Conspiracy virtually. Check out our website. Do all that stuff that Mr. Beast tells you to do when you watch YouTube videos. And I will talk to you next week, Steve.
See you, Bret.